Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? And there being none, the vote is 59-33, and it is adopted. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any senators wishing to vote or to change their vote? There being none, on the amendment, the votes are 59 in favor, 33 against. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside and that my amendment, number 978, be called up.
The request.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I regret that we've heard an objection on pulling up this amendment. Many may not understand that to pull up an amendment to have it considered here in the Senate, it takes unanimous consent. All 100 senators have to agree. My colleague has just objected, making it impossible to consider an amendment that should be debated here on the floor of the House, because this amendment is about good policy and good process. Not so long ago, in the continuing resolution, a provision was slipped in by the House of Representatives, and because this was a must-pass bill under tight time constraints, it also slipped through the U.S. Senate with no debate. And what did this legislation do? This legislation, the Monsanto Protection Act. This legislation does something that I think most would find astounding. It allows the unrestricted sale and planting of new variants of genetically modified seeds that a court has ruled have not been properly examined for their effect on other farmers, the environment, and human health. Now, obviously, this raises a lot of concerns about the impact on farmers and the impact on human health. But there's even more. The fact that the Act instructs the seed producers to ignore a ruling of the court is equally troubling. It raises profound questions about the constitutional separation of powers and the ability of our courts to hold agencies accountable to the law and their responsibilities. I can tell you that this process and this policy has provoked outrage across the country. When I held town halls out in Oregon after this happened, every town hall, it was raised by farmers concerned that this would endanger the crops they're growing and hope to export overseas. And I've received over 2,200 letters on this topic. So I do hope, I'm very hopeful that when we come back next week, we can have a full debate on this amendment, that it won't be objected to, and that certainly there'll be no opportunity of any kind for this policy to be extended, because it hurts a process of holding our departments accountable for enforcing the law, and it provides a policy of overriding a court order designed to protect other farmers, to protect the environment, and to protect human health, and that's absolutely unacceptable. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Senator from Missouri.
President, I want to respond to my friend, Mr. Merkley. This act, which I would think would more properly be called the Farmer Assurance Act, was passed by both the House and Senate and signed into law by President Obama in March of 2013, March of this year. Many have claimed that it was never publicly debated and it was slipped into the bill by the House of Representatives, as my good friend said on the floor just a minute ago, and passed the Senate without debate. Now, this was a big bill, I will admit that, and there was lots of debate. And while that certainly would be, I'm sure, what Mr. Merkley believes happened, I don't think the facts would bear that out. In fact, this language originated, as he said, and was passed by the House after it was debated in committee, and it was posted for several months. This was not mystery language. In fact, on June the 6th, 2012, the House publicly posted their resolution that included this in the Ag Appropriations Bill. It was available on the House website from that point on. Section 733 of the House bill is identical to the Farmer Assurance language included in the final FY 2013 appropriations bill that was passed by the Congress. On June the 19th, 2012, the House Ag Appropriations Bill was passed out of committee. That bill included this exact language. This is June the 19th, 2012, Mr. President. The continuing resolution actually on the Ag FDA, the Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration Rural Development Bill, included a coming together of these two bills. The CR, the continuing resolution, included items in the Senate bill that dealt principally with agricultural research that the House didn't have, and there were provisions in the House version like this one that the Senate accepted. The language was publicly available and posted as part of the agreed-to appropriations bill for 9 days before the vote. A week before the vote, Senator Tester filed an amendment which is exactly like the amendment we just heard about today, because it would have struck this provision. On that same day, Senator Tester spoke at length on the floor about his amendment. This is a week before the continuing resolution is passed, and I don't mind having a debate about the provisions. I do mind the idea that somehow nobody knew about this. Now, I can't watch the debate for every member of the Senate and say, here's what you should have been paying attention to that one of our colleagues said, but it was fairly substantial and took some time, and it was a week before we voted. By the way, nobody in the Senate proposed this provision. Nobody put it in the House bill, as some have contended. But I do think this provision, as it turns out, this policy protects farm families. That's why it was supported by the American Farm Bureau, the American Council of Farm Cooperatives, the American Soybean Association, the National Association of Wheat Growers, the Congressional Hunger Center, the National Corn Growers Association, and others. Many have incorrectly claimed that this language gives priority to the needs of a small number of businesses over the rights or needs of the American consumers. I don't think that's true either. This provision doesn't protect any seed company, Monsanto or Pioneer Seed, or even the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Who it would help would be the family who planted a crop that was legal to plant. Now, my mom and dad were dairy farmers. The one thing I do know about the farming cycle is once you made a decision to plant a crop, it's usually too late to plant another one. And there are times when it is absolutely too late to plant another crop. So what does your family do that year when the crop that the government told you you could plant, some federal judge decides you can't plant it, only to have maybe another, in this two cases where this has happened, other federal judges later said the first federal judge was wrong, and that those crops were legal to be planted, legal to be harvested. Both challenges, by the way, were about what environmental impact this might have if something happened from one property to another. Never a question in those two cases about the safety of the food. But this provision, Mr. President, allows the Secretary of Agriculture to create a way for those farm families to sell that crop, but it doesn't require the Secretary to do that. Now remember, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has already said this is a crop that we've deregulated. It's heavily regulated, these kinds of crops, until the Secretary of Agriculture says it's not. And when the Secretary of Agriculture says it's not, then anybody can plant these crops that wants to. That gives the farmers and their families the assurance that a legally planted crop is likely to be able to be harvested. In addition, the authority granted to the USDA in this language was only temporary. It was in the House bill. It lasted until September 30th of this year. The Secretary of Agriculture said he already had the authority. Didn't seem like to me that in return for ag research and other things we had in our bill that repeating the authority the Secretary of Agriculture said he had and had used was a bad thing. Basically tells the Secretary of Agriculture that if you agree with the court, by the way, and don't think you did your job and you don't intend to appeal the case, you don't have to do anything that allows a crop to be harvested. But if you still think you were right and you're going to appeal that case, you have the authority, if you want to use it, to figure out how to let that crop be harvested for that year. In that time, USDA can determine at any time that a bio crop should not be approved, and USDA can pull its approval on a crop that it has approved. FDA also has to approve the food value of these things before they can go into food. This language, Mr. President, doesn't require USDA to approve biotech crops. It doesn't prevent individuals from suing the government over a biotech crop approval. Ultimately, this language simply codifies the authority the Secretary believes he had. As recently as May the 9th of this year, Secretary Vilsack testified before the Ag Appropriations Subcommittee and said this language, according to Secretary Vilsack, this language, quote, doesn't necessarily do anything I can't already do. We are going to make those decisions based on science and based on the law, which is the way they ought to be made. Unfortunately, if you took a quick search of the Internet, you wouldn't find out these facts. But we have the advantage of we can search actually what the law said, not what somebody else said it might have said. These provisions protect farm families and their livelihoods, and that's why they're supported again by some groups I've mentioned and some I haven't. The American Farm Bureau, the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, the American Soybean Association, the National Association of Wheat Growers, the Congressional Hunger Center, the National Corn Growers Association, the National Cotton Council, the American Sugar Beet Growers Association, ag retailers, biotech industry organizations, the American Seed Trade Association, and many other groups. And facts are stubborn things, and the law here is easy to find and read, and it doesn't say anything about protecting anybody because, frankly, you can't sue these companies anyway. They sold you a legal product. The only people protected here are the people who have put the seeds in the ground, and you can't put those seeds in the ground in August or September and expect to harvest a crop that year. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to take just a few moments to thank colleagues for their work this week, to thank my partner, Senator Cochran, and both of our staffs who've been working very hard to complete the process of this very, very important jobs bill called the Farm Bill. And just let me take a moment to remind everyone that we are talking about 16 million jobs in America that come because of agriculture, because of what we do in the food industry altogether. It's incredibly important that we complete this work. I'm very confident that when we come back into session in another week, that we will complete our process. And I want to thank our majority leader and the Republican leader for their support in us moving through this process. And certainly our majority leader, Senator Reid, has been incredibly supportive and working with us and giving us the time to come directly from committee to the floor of the United States Senate and to work with colleagues through amendments on both sides of the aisle to get this done. We are doing this the way we've always done it, which is in a bipartisan fashion, working through both Democratic and Republican amendments. And at the end of this, we will have produced what I believe is the most reform-minded farm bill in decades. Let me remind our colleagues that we have before us a bill that is different than anything I can think of, actually, in terms of deficit reduction. We have a bill that is over $24 billion in spending cuts put forward by our committee supported by the communities that are affected. $24 billion in deficit reduction, which is much more than we would be required to do against if we just went with the across-the-board cuts that have been so debated, called the sequester. The Agriculture Department and the Farm Bill has a responsibility for $6 billion in deficit reduction through the sequester. We have added to that to add 4 times that amount in deficit reduction. But we're doing it in a smart, focused way, making tough decisions, setting priorities, eliminating subsidies that don't make sense anymore, and strengthening risk management, market-oriented programs. We have debated and will debate more something called crop insurance, which I will remind my colleagues does not create someone getting a check. They get a bill. They pay for crop insurance. We do it in a partnership between the federal government and farmers to help them to be able to have affordable risk management. That's what we strengthen in this bill. We're told by farmers all across the country that the most important risk management tool for them is insurance, crop insurance that's affordable. We have also in this legislation done something that is historic, which is to, as we've moved from subsidies to insurance, tying conservation compliance to the purchase of insurance, which is a very, very important policy. And we have many groups, over 30 groups, that have come together. I want to commend all of the commodity groups and the Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union and all of those who come together, along with environmentalists and conservation organizations, to put a real priority on both a strong risk management system called crop insurance and a strong conservation policy called conservation compliance. And so this is a very important part of our bill as we look to savings. Frankly, we've looked at savings, Mr. President, in every single part of this bill. And really, we have 12 different bills all put together called titles in this thing we call a farm bill. And we've looked at savings in each area of the bill. We have, for instance, taken a hard look at our conservation programs and decided that instead of 23 different kinds of programs, we actually could consolidate and streamline down to 13, put them in 4 different buckets of activities with a lot of flexibility, working with community groups, grassroots groups on conservation, and that we could save money, which we've done. We listened to mayors and rural communities around Michigan, around the country, and those that represent townships and counties who said, make sure you continue to have a strong rural development, economic development presence. Once you get outside the cities in Michigan or around the country, every community is partnering with rural development for business loans, water and sewer projects, transportation, fire trucks and police trucks and housing and all those efforts working through rural development. But we heard from our local officials that it was complicated. We currently in law have 11 different definitions of rural. Made no sense. They said, could you please just give us one? And so we looked through all of the different programs, streamlined it down, and have one definition so it's easier to work with, less paperwork, and makes much more sense. We have continued to strengthen the part of our agricultural economy called specialty crops, near and dear to me in Michigan, fresh fruits and vegetables and all the other areas that are very important to many states, including mine. The organic community, a fast-growing part of agriculture, we strengthen that as well. We have looked from Mississippi to Michigan and California to Delaware and everything in between to be able to make sure this is a bill that works for all parts of agriculture, and I'm pleased to say that we have been able to do that. We have also made sure that the energy title is strong, both in supporting farmers and ranchers who want to be focused on energy efficiency on the farm or the ranch, and also we have expanded efforts beyond our traditional biofuel efforts to something that is near and dear to my heart, which is called bio-based manufacturing. We have very exciting opportunities in America, and I know that our presiding officer is passionate about manufacturing, as I am. And we now have the opportunity through working with our agricultural groups to create ways to replace petroleum and plastics and other types of materials that we have today, synthetic fibers and so on, with agricultural byproducts. We are actually seeing, if you buy many of our great American automobiles, you are sitting on foam that is actually made from soybean oil instead of petroleum oil, so you're sitting on soybeans in the seats, Mr. President. And we have many parts of the interior of the automobiles that you are now buying actually have some kind of agricultural byproduct, whether it is wheat chaff or corn husks or soybean oil. And we know that we can use these new opportunities to not only create markets, but create situations that are much better for our environment and that create jobs. So this is a new, exciting part of what we are doing to expand opportunities through the energy title as well. We also are very pleased and proud with the efforts around nutrition for folks in this country who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves hit hard by the economy, making sure that they continue to have the support that they need around food assistance is absolutely critical. And I'm pleased that we have stood together in opposing very damaging amendments to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, because as crop insurance is important for our farmers when they have a disaster, food assistance is important for our families when they have a disaster. And I think that reflects the best about us as Americans to make sure that we are providing that assistance. We also are making sure that we are doing more around farmers markets and fresh fruits and vegetables in schools, making local food hubs a possibility so that we have local farmers being able to come together and be able to market their products as well. So there are many, many pieces in this Farm Bill that all relate back to jobs, all relate back to reforms that we've put in place, and relate to making sure that we have the continuation of the safest, most affordable food supply in the world here in America. When we go home tonight, if you sit down and to have some supper, thank a farmer. And we all understand this is the riskiest business in the world, and the job of the Farm Bill is to provide support and risk management tools for our growers when they need them, but also to be great stewards of taxpayer dollars and to do what is right for rural communities across America and for families that need some temporary help as well. So there are many, many pieces. I haven't even mentioned all of them, Mr. President, but I did want to remind people why we take the time on the floor to work through these issues and these amendments. We have more work to do, but we see the light at the end of the tunnel. We'll be putting together a list for final votes on amendments as we go into, when we come back into session. And we're looking forward to doing that and to completing this effort again. And I would remind colleagues, we did this last year. The House did not do their job. They did in committee on a bipartisan basis, not on the floor. We did our job. Last time around, I remember doing 73 different votes on this particular bill. We wrapped in almost every single one of those amendments that was passed into the bill that we presented to the Senate this time. We are continuing to work together on other amendments as well, but it will be time when we get back to bring this to closure and to once again demonstrate that the United States Senate can work together on a bipartisan basis to do the right thing for the families and the businesses and the farmers and the ranchers that we represent. 16 million people in this country are counting on us to get our job done, and I'm sure that we will. Thank you, Mr. President.
From Mississippi.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to join my distinguished colleague from Michigan in predicting that we are moving in the right direction, and we've covered a lot of important issues during the debate of the last a couple of days, taken up a good many amendments, had record votes, a free and full discussion of a lot of issues that are affected by this legislation. And I must say that it's been a remarkable performance in terms of the subjects that have been covered, amendments disposed of, and true progress made in developing what I think can be a very important contribution toward a legal framework and support structure to help enable American farmers to compete in the international marketplace, to sustain the jobs that flow from these important activities throughout the United States at a time when in some places jobs are hard to find. This is a job creator, and it's a step toward strengthening our economy, not just in rural America, but throughout the country, in municipalities as well. So I think everybody ought to recognize what a strong leader our committee chairman has become and demonstrated in her performance as chairman of our committee. She's done an excellent job. I commend her and all of our colleagues on the committee for helping shape this product so that it can be adopted by the Senate and signed into law by the President. I look forward to that day and to celebrating and helping salute those who've been responsible for this good work. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
From Ohio.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to join my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in condemning the Internal Revenue Service for intentionally singling out dozens of nonprofit organizations for no cause other than their political leanings. This is not an issue of Democrat versus Republican. Indeed, the actions of the IRS have brought rare bipartisan accord, including here on this floor. There are lessons for all of us in this scandal. One is that government that's too big, too powerful, and too all-encompassing is prone to overstep its bounds. It's become unwieldy and inefficient, and sometimes it tramples upon the rights of the people it's supposed to serve. We have an IRS that targeted groups of Americans, threatening them with the force of law and imprisonment for no other reason than they had certain political affiliations. We know now that the IRS selected these groups by zeroing in on certain words and certain phrases. And what were those words and phrases that elicited such concern in the halls of the IRS? Words like patriot, words like we the people. It seems to me we can draw only one of two conclusions from the actions of the IRS. Either some intentionally attempted to use the power of the federal government to target and cripple their political enemies, or they lack the competence to oversee a bureaucracy that has grown too big not to fail. One thing is for sure, though. The reputation of the IRS has been tarnished in ways that will take time to repair, and it's imperative that we restore the trust that has been lost between the American people and our government. That work begins by getting to the bottom of what happened. We've got lots of questions that need answers. Did the IRS officials act on their own, or did they have discretion from their superiors? How high up does this scandal go? What did the White House know, and when did they know it? The scandal comes as Washington is preparing to hand over even more power and authority to the Internal Revenue Service. It would be the IRS that enforces the mandates of the new health care law. It will be the IRS that will have control over some of our most private, personal decisions. It's not too late to change course, but if we insist on placing the blame for IRS's actions on a few low-level staffers without looking at the root cause of the abuse, corruption, or a government that, as the President's former senior advisor, David Axelrod recently admitted, has become too vast to manage and oversee, then we will continue to witness scandals like this one. Big government comes with big problems, big scandals, and sometimes big dangers for our liberties. The Tea Party and organizations like it have been arguing that position since they were founded. And while I know there's some in this chamber who will not like hearing this, it turns out the Tea Party's fears were justified here. Mr. President, we need more than just an audit of what happened at the IRS. We've given the IRS every opportunity to deal with this issue internally. More than a year ago, Senator Hatch and I sent a letter to the IRS expressing our concern about the targeting of conservative groups. We received a response assuring us that our concerns were unfounded. Everything was okay. We now know that that response was false, perhaps intentionally misleading. Tuesday, former Commissioner Stephen Miller appeared before the Finance Committee in which I serve. During that hearing, he claimed that while he had dispatched a team to investigate our concerns a month before he responded to our letter, in response to our letter, his response to the letter was sent without input from the team. In other words, he sent a team to investigate this. A month went by, then he responded to our letter, but without the information that they had given him. He claims he did learn that targeting had occurred, but he learned that a week after misinforming us that everything was fine. He said when he heard, he was outraged. And yet he never corrected the record, choosing instead to follow the false response that he had sent us. He allowed it to stand. So, Mr. President, at the very least, we have a situation where the IRS, knowing what had happened, a week after they sent us a response saying everything was fine, refused to correct the record. I believed them at the time, as did others on the committee. And unfortunately, we were misinformed. Yesterday, Lois Lerner, the head of the IRS's tax-exempt organizations division, declined to answer questions regarding the scandal, deciding instead to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. This is not a way to get to the bottom of it. Despite all this, the IRS asks us to trust them that when they tell us that this scandal was simply a result of a few misguided low-level employees and that no senior officials were involved. With all due respect, Mr. President, I think members of my committee, and certainly I, am done taking the IRS's word for it. We need an in-depth investigation, one that fully documents the what, when, and who of the scandal. Only when we get to the bottom of this incident can we begin to rebuild the bridge of trust between us as citizens and our federal government here in Washington, D.C. Mr. President, I yield back my time.
Mr. President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to talk a little bit about the Farm Bill, which is before the Senate. Notwithstanding all the rhetoric that we have had around the budget over the last 4 years or so around here, last year the Senate Agriculture was the only committee, to my knowledge, in either house, the Senate or the House, who passed a bipartisan deficit reduction plan. We did it together, Democrats and Republicans working together on the committee with the various constituencies around the United States of America. And that bill ultimately passed the Senate in a broad bipartisan vote right here on this floor. The House of Representatives was unable, for whatever reason, to enact a version of the Farm Bill over there, which was an incredible disservice to rural America. Farmers in my state, ranchers in my state, the state of Colorado, faced an unprecedented drought throughout this entire period. And throughout the summer of 2012, when I was traveling the state, no one was talking about the presidential election, particularly in these rural areas, which was on the mind of everybody here in Washington. What they wanted to know was why a farm bill hadn't been passed, and for good reason. Because the Senate had passed a bill that was supported by both Republicans and Democrats, by producers of all types across the country, and it was a good piece of legislation. Well, now fast forward, Mr. President, to this week, when the Senate Ag Committee once again passed a bipartisan bill with meaningful deficit reduction. And I want to thank Chairwoman Stabenow from Michigan and the ranking member, Senator Thad Cochran, for their leadership on this bill. This bill now has gone through two different ranking members on the Republican side. It has been supported in a bipartisan way, as I said earlier. And this farm bill, like the last version we passed, reflects the values and the process that we want to see in other areas of our budget. We identify priorities in this bill. We streamline duplication in this bill. We break away from old, inefficient ways of doing business in this farm bill. We eliminate direct payments, and one of the most significant reforms we've seen in a farm bill in a very long time. These payments are issued to farmers regardless of economic need or market signals. We do away with that abuse. This bill prioritizes what is working for producers, and it strengthens crop insurance as a result, which is what my farmers have said is the most important thing to them. Mr. President, I've spoken on this floor before about Colorado's battle against historic drought conditions. Some farmers lost over half their corn yields in 2012 alone. It's hard to imagine, when you think about it, any business losing half of its production in 1 year, but that's what happened to Colorado's corn growers. Crop insurance is what's keeping farmers in rural economies in business in this country, and that's why this should be a priority. It's why this bill should have been passed 2 years ago when it first came to the floor of the Senate, and it's why we should pass it next month. Beyond crop insurance, another key highlight of this bill for those of us from Colorado is conservation. The title carries over the reforms from last year's bill, and this year's bill includes a provision to ensure that recipients of government-supported crop insurance comply with basic conservation requirements. This measure is the result of a historic agreement between the commodity groups and the conservation groups in this country. It's supported by a wide variety of stakeholders, from the Farm Bureau to the National Wildlife Federation. This revamped conservation title is huge for rural America and for my state. It's critical for farming and ranching families looking to keep their land and agriculture generation to generation. It's incredibly important for our hunters and sportsmen. And it's important for anybody in this country, which is most of us, who care about the long-term health of our soil, our air, and our water. These conservation measures help us improve the efficiency of production agriculture and improve the quality of the environment in farm country. We recognize at home that keeping these landscapes in their historical undeveloped state is an economic driver for our entire state and for our entire region, for tourism, for wildlife habitat. As I've traveled Colorado over the last several years, farmers and ranchers constantly were talking to me about the importance of conservation. They highlighted in particular conservation easements, which provide Department of Agriculture assistance to help landowners who are interested in voluntarily conserving the farming and ranching heritage of their land. And I want to spend a few minutes sharing stories that Coloradans have shared with me. This is a photo, Mr. President. You don't have this as much in Delaware. I know you have other things, but here is a photo of a ranch in Colorado named the Music Meadows Ranch. It's outside of West Cliff, Colorado, elevation 9,000 feet. I have a version of this picture in my office here in Washington. It's 4,000 acres. The rancher's name is Ellen Ganschow, and it's some of the finest grass-fed beef in the country are raised by Ellen and her family at this ranch. Thanks to the Grassland Reserve Program, Ellen's ranch now has a permanent conservation easement. It provides wildlife habitat for elk, mule deer, pronghorn antelope, black bear, and mountain lion, species that are prized by Colorado sportsmen, and they contribute millions of dollars to our state's economy. And she has been able to continue to have her family ranch. Thanks to an amendment adopted by the Ag Committee this year, we'll see even more of these easements happen on high-priority landscapes like the Music Meadows Ranch. And I want to thank the Chairwoman, Chairman Stabenow, and Senator Cochran for working so hard with me to get that amendment approved. Private lands conservation like this one, this type, aided by the Farm Bill, is absolutely critical for so many reasons. It is poorly understood, I think, in the East, but it is an incredibly important tool for those of us in the West to keep our family farms and ranches, and to provide the habitat that's needed for our sportsmen and for tourism. Here's another example of why this bill is so crucial for our sportsmen and our outdoor recreation economy. This is a photo taken of a friend, John Gale, hunting pheasants in Yuma County, Colorado. The Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, provides important habitat for pheasants and other upland birds all across the country. The land surrounding this photo is all CRP land, everything that you can see and far beyond that, and it's enabled this pheasant hunting to happen in our state. The CRP program protects habitats in addition to holding in place highly erodible soil, something we have a lot of history with in Colorado, like the soil in Baca County, Colorado, where over 250,000 acres are enrolled in CRP. Baca County was absolutely devastated by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, as chronicled in Tim Egan's The Worst Hard Time and other books. Thanks to CRP, Baca County has weathered recent droughts much better than it otherwise would have. Mr. President, healthy grasslands, open landscapes, and abundant wildlife are a fundamental part of what it is to be in the West. And we need to preserve these grasslands, these open spaces, and these species. And that's what this title does, the conservation title of the Farm Bill. And I strongly support this new conservation title as reported out of the committee in a bipartisan vote. I know some are going to try to amend this bipartisan consensus. And one of the great things about serving on the Agriculture Committee is there is so little partisanship. The differences that we have are not Republican versus Democrat. We have some differences, but they tend to be regional and understandable. But we have a way and a process and the leadership to actually work through it together. It'd be nice if we did more of that around here. And I'm worried that there are going to be some amendments that are going to come forward, among other things, in the name of deficit reduction, which, as I mentioned earlier, is already reflected by this committee's work, unlike every other committee in the United States Congress. The Lee Amendments 1017 and 1018, I appreciate his efforts, my neighbor from Utah's efforts at deficit reduction. These amendments repeal the important programs I've been talking about here, on which our farmers and ranchers rely, and they keep our soil on the ground and not in our wind and air. Lee number 1017 repeals the CRP program I spoke about earlier. And I've been on this floor many times to talk about cutting our deficit. And I'm glad to have been part of a process that's actually led to deficit reduction. We need to put the entire budget under a microscope, including agriculture, to cut waste and eliminate redundancies. And let me say again, including agriculture. And we have. The bill we have on this floor makes those cuts, $24 billion in all. Some $6 billion of these cuts come from conservation, and not all of those cuts are cuts that I like, but I agreed to them in the package that we were moving forward. We made difficult compromises at the committee level, and now we have a more efficient conservation title as a result that won support from both sides of the aisle. Over 650 conservation groups support the conservation title before us, and I would urge my colleagues to support it and to oppose amendments that would weaken the title and undermine the good work of Republicans and Democrats on the committee. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I rise today to discuss some of the amendments that I've offered to the 2013 Farm Bill. And first of all, let me start by thanking the chairwoman and the ranking member for their leadership in listening to the voices of the members of the Agriculture Committee when it comes to reauthorizing the Farm Bill, which is set to expire at the end of September. And we haven't been able to agree on all aspects of the Farm Bill. Our chairwoman and ranking member, however, should be recognized for their tireless work in getting a Farm Bill done this year. One way or the other, we do need to move this process forward. We came close last year when the Senate passed a Farm Bill, but we were unable to get the House to move it, and I'm hoping this year we can complete that process and get a bill that's actually able to put on the President's desk and be able to give the producers around this country the certainty that they need when it comes to planting and to make decisions about the future of their farming operations. Mr. President, while this bill is commonly called the Farm Bill, the majority of the spending in this bill is not for agricultural producers. The nutrition title of this bill, which is primarily food stamps or what we refer to as SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, accounts for 77% of the spending in the Farm Bill programs over the next 10 years. Let me repeat that. 77% of all spending in this Farm Bill doesn't have anything to do with production agriculture, but is in what we refer to as the nutrition title of the Farm Bill. It's important that we subject all areas of federal spending close examination, and that includes the nutrition title of the Farm Bill. It shouldn't be any exception. I've recently introduced legislation that would reform several components of the nutrition title and save more than $30 billion from the $760 billion nutrition title, and that's a 10-year number. These common sense reforms to SNAP generate significant savings without altering benefits to needy families. The SNAP program is exceedingly complex, and we should be vigilant to ensure that taxpayers' money is indeed going to help lift those in need out of poverty, instead of going to ineffective programs that are mired in bureaucracy. I've offered several parts of this reform package as amendments to the Farm Bill currently on the floor. My Amendment 991, which I hope to have an opportunity to get voted on after we return following next week, reforms the Nutrition, Education, and Obesity Prevention Grant Program. While well-intended, the current structure of this program funnels 52% of the funding to only 4 states. This is an inequitable use of funds that should be spent more equitably among program participants. My amendment restructures these grants so that the states can receive up to $5 per SNAP enrollee, indexed for inflation. $5 is the median value of what is currently being spent on this education program per capita across all the states. This amendment in no way limits the capacity of the states to leverage those federal dollars with their own funding to deliver more nutrition education services. By reforming these grants, all recipients of SNAP benefits will have more equal access, I should say, to nutrition education and obesity prevention resources that help them to make healthy choices when shopping on a budget. Mr. President, this amendment will save $2 billion. $2 billion over the next 10 years without impacting SNAP's benefits for those in need. Again, I want to stress this, that reforming this program does not affect the true mission of the SNAP program, which is providing food assistance to needy families. Nothing in this amendment changes eligibility requirements for SNAP benefits. Even after this nutrition education program is reformed, approximately $250 million a year will still be available to the states for these education programs. The priority of the SNAP program should be providing food assistance to needy families while they work to get back on their feet. Unfortunately, the nutrition education and obesity grant program has become so partial to just a few large states that these states are expanding the use of these grants to fund lobbying campaigns instead of reaching out to educate SNAP families on making healthy choices while shopping on a budget. Clearly, Mr. President, this program is in need of reform. Making common sense changes to the SNAP program shows the American people that we are holding each federal program up to the light, making sure that the taxpayers' money is being spent for the public good. Again, these are largely administrative changes to the SNAP program that do not impact SNAP benefits for those who are truly in need of food assistance. A $2 billion cut represents less than 0.5% of what the federal government will spend on SNAP over the next 10 years. I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me today in telling the American people that we're committed to program integrity and equality among SNAP beneficiaries. I look forward in the course of the next weeks when we get back on this bill to engaging my colleagues in a fair and open debate about how we can improve all Farm Bill programs that strengthen the stability and safety of our nation's food supply for the next 5 years and beyond. Mr. President, this is a common sense amendment that saves us a couple of $1 billion that we can add to the savings in this bill in a time when we've got rising deficits and debt, budgetary constraints that we're operating with, and I would hope that we would be able to come together in the interest of reform that actually targets programs' administrative costs, that does not impact benefits that are so needed for people who truly do need food assistance. So I will hope to get that amendment voted on, Mr. President, when we return to the bill. The second amendment I wanted to mention today is another one that I have filed, and that deals with the commodity title of the Farm Bill. Now, last year, this body passed a Farm Bill by a vote of 64 to 35, a Farm Bill that most of us believed offered a level of reform that we could support and defend to the American taxpayer. Mr. President, several of my colleagues and I pointed out in the Ag Committee debate, we have deep concerns regarding what we believe is a step backwards in the commodity title of this bill with the creation of the Adverse Market Payments, or what we call now the AMP program. This program takes us a step backwards from last year's Farm Bill by recreating a program with counter-cyclical payments and fixed target prices, a program that the Senate Farm Bill completely eliminated last year. Mr. President, our concern is not our concerns are not crop specific, but they're policy specific. Most Ag Committee members were told by our producers that they don't need an additional commodity title program and that a sound crop insurance program is a much higher priority. My amendment, number 1092, is a response to the wishes of most of the farmers in the United States. It simply strikes the newly created and unneeded Adverse Market Payments, or AMP program, and places peanuts and rice back into the ARC program. To put it simply, this amendment restores the reform-minded, market-oriented commodity title included in the Farm Bill that we passed in the Senate last year. Mr. President, this amendment also saves taxpayers more than $3 billion relative to the bill that is on the floor today. High target prices are an outdated concept from past farm bills. They distort planning decisions, they raise trade compliance issues, and they're not an effective use of limited taxpayer dollars. Now, while I appreciate the work that our chairwoman and ranking member have put into this farm bill, I believe the inclusion of target prices is a step backward from a market-oriented farm policy that is anchored by a strong crop insurance program. I urge my colleagues, Mr. President, again, to support this amendment that recaptures the level of reform that we achieved in last year's farm bill and at the same time saves more than $3 billion over the bill that is on the floor today. And so, Mr. President, both of these amendments have been filed. I hope that as the debate moves forward, we can get these amendments up and voted on. If we're really serious about moving farm policy in this country in a direction of reform, a farm policy that is market-oriented, a farm policy that's about the future and not the past, then this commodity title amendment makes all the sense in the world and, again, saves $3 billion over the bill that's on the floor today. And I would simply say with regard to the nutrition title amendment that too, Mr. President, saves a couple of $1 billion, makes reforms that I think create greater efficiency in the food stamp program and help address what I think is a very serious need that we all need to be aware and conscious of in this particular time that we're in, and that is the out-of-control spending, the out-of-control debt that we're passing on to our children and our grandchildren and future generations. Passing a farm bill that achieves the highest level possible of additional savings, to me, seems to be a very high priority, and both of these amendments address that particular objectives. So, Mr. President, I look forward to getting these amendments hopefully voted on when we return, and with that I yield the floor, and I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte.
The Senate throughout the day has been working on additional amendments to the Farm Bill, approving ones on investigating crop insurance fraud and voting to reduce crop insurance subsidies for top-earning farmers. They also rejected an amendment to end federal subsidies for tobacco growers. Earlier today, they voted to confirm President Obama's choice to serve as a judge on the appeals court for the District of Columbia, Srinivasan. During this quorum call, we're going to show you some of the debate from earlier on the Senate floor.
Mr. President, I grew up, that's what I wanted to be as a baseball player, as I was a boy, but I didn't take long until I learned that I wasn't big enough, fast enough, or good enough to be the baseball player of my dreams, but that hasn't taken away my love of the game. I followed it so closely for these many years, and I followed it really, really closely. I was a cheerleader for any team that Greg Maddox was on. He came from Valley High School in Las Vegas, was almost immediately was a star baseball player in the major leagues, and whatever team he was on was the team that I cheered for. I've been here in Washington now for a number of years. They've had, in recent years, a professional baseball team. I'm reminded, Mr. President, when I was going to law school back here and working in this building, I went to Griffith Stadium and watched baseball games. I only watched two, but I watched the Washington Senators play the New York Yankees twice. Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra, all that crowd. So I remember that. In recent years, in fact, the last 2 years, I have focused on the Nationals a lot because of another phenomenon from Las Vegas by the name of Bryce Harper. And he's meant so much to that team, as we learned last night. He's recovering from running into the wall at full speed, hurting himself. But last night he was the reason they won. He had a home run and a double in the 10th inning and made a sensational catch. He's really very, very good. The reason I mention that, Mr. President, Davey Johnson is the manager of the Washington Nationals. He's managed 5 different Major League Baseball teams. He's one of the greatest managers in the history of baseball. Won pennants, won national championships. But what would the Washington Nationals be like today if he didn't have the ability to have the players he wanted? That someone would say, okay, you can have your third baseman, Ryan Zimmerman, but you have to wait. You're not going to get him at the beginning of the season. You can wait until August. We'll let him come in August. Or their first baseman, LaRoche. He's a good first baseman, Golden Glover, but you can't have him for a while. Wait for a few months and then we can bring him on. Well, that, Mr. President, is an example of what is going on here in the United States Senate. The President of the United States does not have the team that he wants, the team that he deserves. Yesterday, my friend, and he is my friend, the minority leader, offered a full-throated defense of the dysfunctional status quo here in Capitol Hill. Here's what he said, quote, I think we've demonstrated there's no real problem here, end of quote, talking about the Senate. This he said yesterday on this floor. Congress has an approval rating that I don't even like to talk about. It's real low. Senator McConnell stood on the Senate floor and said things here in Congress are going just fine. I think it's safe to say Americans disagree. And, Mr. President, I'm on their side. Senator McConnell is free to defend this Republican-created logjam that exists in the Senate today. But I'll not join him in this defense. The problem of gridlock in Washington is real, and it must be fixed. I'm committed to making the Senate work again. These remarks I'm giving here today are only in an effort to get this body to work well. There's nothing sinister in what I'm saying. I just want the Senate to work well. I've been here a long time, Mr. President, and it didn't work this way before. Despite the agreement we reached in January of this year, Republican obstruction on nominees continues unabated, no different than it was the last Congress. The minority leader used strong words yesterday, accusing me of going back on my word. I take that accusation very seriously. It's true that in January, Democrats and Republicans entered into an agreement. Republicans agreed to cease the endless obstruction of presidential nominees. They agreed that they would work with us, quote, to schedule votes on nominees in a timely manner except in extraordinary circumstances. End of quote. Now, Mr. President, this is what he said, Minority Leader said. I just quoted that. He said it this year. I repeat, Republicans agreed they would no longer block the President nominees without extraordinary circumstances. Mr. President, look at the dictionary about extraordinary circumstances. Here's how it's defined. Going beyond what is usual, regular, or customary. That's not some definition I came up with. That's the definition in the dictionary. Extraordinary is defined as going beyond what is usual, regular, or customary. So, in return for their saying that's what they would do, we agreed that we would not consider any changes to the Senate rules outside of regular order. Democrats have kept our word. We intend to keep our word. We've not altered the rules. But since we entered into that agreement, Republicans have failed to hold up their end of the bargain. What they have done this past 5 months has not been usual, regular, or customary, as defined in the dictionary. Not only have they failed to work with us to schedule votes on nominees in a timely manner, they're doing everything in their power to deny the President his team and thus undermine Obama's presidency. So instead of throwing about accusations, let's look at the facts. Let's stick to the facts. Republican obstruction has slowed down nearly every nominee that President Obama has submitted. Even cabinet secretaries have faced unparalleled procedural hurdles, and Republicans are threatening to block many more of them. For example, in the some 230-plus years we've been a country, for the first time in the history of this country, while a war is going on and one is winding down, for the first time in the history of this country, Senate Republicans filibustered the nomination of Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, who, by the way, is a Republican and, by the way, is a Vietnam hero for his combat activities there and was a Republican senator from Nebraska. The Minority Leader himself is threatening to block President Obama's nominee for Secretary of Labor, and he said so. Secretary of Labor is a good person. Mr. President, he put himself through school working as a garbage man. His parents are immigrants. Republicans on the now, Mr. President, what we have done here for generations of the Senate is we have hearings on these nominees, and that's the way it should be. And there in recent years have been, after the hearings have taken place, a senator will say, I have a few more questions. We'll send them. And it was hand 2 or 3, 4 or 5 questions. With Secretary Geithner, who has recently resigned as Secretary of Treasury, he got 28 questions. But, Mr. President, no, I'm going to finish my statement. Mr. President, we understand that now what has happened in these committees is that they ask all the questions they want in the committee. That's not good enough for them. 28 questions, not enough. For example, on Gina McCarthy, who wants to be head of the President's asked that she be his Director of Environment and Public Works, the EPA, I'm sorry. More than 1,100 questions were submitted to her after the hearing. Jack Lew, who has had basically many jobs in government, he had a full hearing. They gave him more than 700 questions to answer. This has gotten way out of hand. Anything that they can do to slow things down, that's what they do. Executive and judicial nominees who are ready to be confirmed by the Senate have been pending an average of 200 days, more than 6 months. Now, Mr. President, listen to that. Executive and judicial nominees who are ready to be confirmed by the Senate have been pending an average of 200 days. That's more than 6 months. The confirmation process has moved at glacial pace because of extraordinary Republican obstruction. Cloture has been filed on 58 of President Obama's nominees. 58. By this point in President Bush's term, cloture had been filed on a handful of nominees. But Republicans are not blocking these nominations because they object.
Appreciate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I would ask unanimous consent that the following amendments be in order. Moran 987 and Coons Johans 1079. That at 5:30 p.m. Monday, June 3rd, the Senate proceed to votes in relation to the two amendments in the order listed, that there be no second-degree amendments in order to either amendment prior to the votes, and that there be 2 minutes equally divided between the votes.
Is there objection?